has its own touch. I mean, just the artistry alone is beautiful. Just absolutely stunning. So, sit back, relax, and welcome. Okay. So, this book is dedicated for my mom, who taught me to see magic everywhere. Oh, beautiful. Chapter 1. It was not my intention to cause mischief immediately upon arriving back at the font, despite what anyone else may tell you. And yet, by the time the night was over, I was drunk. My nose was bleeding, and Sebastian Grimm was furious with me. I should have noted that only one of these things was unusual. In order to understand these happenings, you must first understand the circumstances of my return to the font. Chiefly, that I was lucky to be there at all. My previous year of study had come to a close with an unfortunate incident involving a spell that caused one of my instructors to think she was a duck for a full hour. And no matter how much I argued that this was how the spell was supposed to work, no one seemed to agree that explanation made things better. I'd been allowed to come back, but it had involved quite a lot of hand-wringing and promises of good behavior on my part, as well as some stern lectures that threatened of immediate expulsion if I did not meet certain standards on the part of the font's academic board. In short, I was on thin ice before even stepping foot on the font grounds. The sun was setting as I passed through the city gate mysterious streets of the northern quarter, where I proceeded to distract myself with music and cards and good company. The night's air was mild when I stumbled out onto the streets hours later. Summer still clinging to it. I decided to take the long way back in order to enjoy both the breeze and my last few moments of freedom. Despite that, I'm certain I would have reached the font gates before the midnight bell struck, were it not for two factors. One, I was slightly tipsy, only slightly, but that was enough for me to be distracted by the moon peeking out from beneath the building spires above me. And I took a wrong turn. Two, I was followed by two of my companions from that night's card table. Perhaps they were upset by the amount of their coin I'd managed to walk away with. Or perhaps the celebratory winner's song I'd played while perched on top of the bar had rubbed them the wrong way. Who's to say? Usually, I was better at spotting sore losers, but I'd entered the game already inebriated, which improved my opinion of most people. I had just enough presence of mind to make a few quick turns and then scramble up a drain pipe before my followers could match my pace. Perhaps if I was a caster of more direct approach, would have been possible. But there were two kinds of sorcerers: those who cast spells and those who write them. I was the latter, and not even an impressive scriber at that. I held my breath. That's impressive. Oh, 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 oh. I'm tripping. I held my breath as my two erstwhile gaming companions rounded the corner and looked around wildly. Lost him, the man with the deep voice said. Well, we know where he's going, the woman replied. She wore tall red boots that I had complimented her on back when we'd been friends an hour ago. The font is back in session tomorrow, and only a sorcerer would be seen about town in one of those hideous coats. I bristled at this. My coat was mid-length and black, with many pockets both on the outside and running along the inner lining. A sorcerer's coat is a wonderful thing to have, with spells on the pockets, so you can only carry far more than the space should have allowed for, and more magic woven into the fabric to keep the wearer cool in summer and warm in winter. I also thought it happened to be an unquestionably stylish piece of clothing, and that I looked quite dashing in it. My would-be robbers, unaware of my outrage, continued in the direction of the vault. Once their footsteps had faded, I pulled myself from the gutter and onto the roof proper. by scrambling over Lux's rooftops. It was a fast, if more dangerous, route. The journey went mostly without incident, though I did lose several minutes untangling my boot from the wash line full of someone's clothing. Nevertheless, when I finally caught sight of the font's grand front gate, my followers were still nowhere in sight. I shimmied down another drain pipe with more haste than grace, clutching my violin case awkwardly, then darted across the road. It wasn't until I slid to a stop in front of the gate that I realized something that should have been clear to me from first glance. It was shut. This was a fairly new development. Until recently, the font stores had been open all hours of the day. But the previous year, a troop of courtier members had gone rogue and broken into one of the library's locked vaults, stealing an undisclosed number of extremely rare spells. Needless to say, security measures had been heightened in the wake of the robbery. These measures included closing the gates at midnight, and as I now belatedly recalled, I swore softly and looked over my shoulder. You missed the midnight bell by 20 minutes at least. The voice was flat, remarkable only for its deep tenor and the unmistakable disapproval lacing each word. I flinched in surprise and looked back towards the door just as a figure stepped forward from the collected gloom. The collected gloom of the gate's arch. Oh, hello, Grim, I said with little enthusiasm. Sebastian Grimm lived up to his name in every way imaginable. Like a thundercloud in human form, his hair was a shockingly pale gray, and had been that way even when we first met at 17. A permanent line of displeasure was etched between his dark brows, and his mouth had a habit of settling into a thin line, turning his expression sour. Or, at least, that was the expression he wore whenever he caught sight of me. Grimm's usually immaculate sorcerer's coat was covered in a thin layer of dust, and the indigo caster's sash wrapped around his waist was greased. A bag hung from his shoulders, packed so tightly the seams were straining. It looked heavy. Grim looked tired. Grim was always easiest to annoy when he was tired, and I have always been unable to resist low-hanging fruit. I shook my head and made a tutting sound with my tongue. Sebastian Grimm, out cavorting the night before our final tier commencements. What is the world coming to? Grimm's lips tugged at the corners. My return was delayed when the stream decided to forge itself a new path directly across one of the main roads. It took the coterie. Oh wait. It took the coterie nearly 2 hours to spell it back in place. He gave me a once-over, making note of my rumpled clothing and flushed face. What's your excuse? Lost track of time, I said, and winked for good measure. What are you waiting here for? Grim looked down his nose at me. It was a particularly stupid bug he was thinking about stepping on. No one answered when I knocked. I laughed. Do you mean to say, in nearly 5 years of attending the font, you've never bothered to find another way in besides the front gate? Grim tellingly said nothing. It was not so surprising, considering what I knew of his habits. No reveling with friends in the streets of Lux for Sebastian Grimm. I could not imagine he had ever found himself in a situation that demanded sneaking back into the vault after hours. It was tempting, very tempting, to turn around and leave it there without another word. It's undoubtedly what Grimm would have done to me had our positions been reversed. But I couldn't help but think what would happen if my pursuers arrived and found Grimm outside the gate instead of me. I wasn't concerned for his safety. Understand, but the last thing I needed was for Grimm to discover I'd been gambling. I wasn't sure he'd be only too eager to share my transgressions with the font's board of sorcerers, and I'd already received a very clearly worded letter from them detailing exactly what happened if I so much as thought about breaking a rule this year. I sighed heavily. Come along, then. Or do you intend to sleep in the dust of the street night, simply to avoid following me? Then I turned on my heel and started walking, not bothering to wait for an answer. After a moment, I was rewarded by the sound of Grimm's footsteps, leaving the gate to trail reluctantly after me down the road. Around the eastern side of the font, there is a particularly pretty stretch of wall where trees border the walkway and the branches stretch up and outward, leaning over to kiss leaves with the trees overflowing from the font's garden within. By day, this area is a popular place to stroll because of the shade and the view. By night, it's the perfect place to sneak over the wall, making use of the natural handholds provided by greenery. There were, of course, spells in place to prevent outsiders from doing this. But Grimm and I were not outsiders. We were simply residents resorting to inconvenient measures. I'd climbed these trees many times on my own since the Midnight Bell's implementations, when I'd been unwilling to let the font's rules deprive me of a full night of see us over the wall easily. He looked at me expectantly. "Oh," I said, surprised. "You want me to write it?" "It's only a charm, Lovage," Grim said. "You should be capable of that much." Yes. Yes. I could write charms. Cantrips too. I could even transcribe other scribers' grand magic spells without issue. It was when I wrote my own that things went wrong. That was what Grim was hinting at. Grand magic had a habit of turning out so poorly for me that I avoided writing it altogether. My last brush with it had been an accident in second tier when I'd unintentionally written a wind spell with a bit too much power built into it. The demonstration of said spell had destroyed an entire classroom, knocked one person out a first-story window, Grim, and resulted in the cracking of 3 ribs, my own. This had earned me a bit of a reputation, as well as a fair amount of laughter and whispers behind my back. A fond-trained scriber who couldn't write grand magic. What was the point? I had said something very similar to my father when he insisted I enroll. In fact, I believe my exact words were, "Why would I want to spend 5 years as a laughingstock?" I'd been considered a scribing prodigy when I was young, but that talent had withered on the vine. I'd held more promise as a child than I ever would again. But my father had yet to accept this. "You've had a place at the font since you were born," he said. "Well, I don't want it," I told him, which had led to a week of heated arguments, and ended with him making it clear that if I didn't attend the font and become a 5th-tier sorcerer like my older brother had, I could kiss my portion of the inheritance goodbye. The money, the title, the land holdings, all of it. I didn't much like to think about the confrontation, but sometimes my father's parting words still echoed in my ears. "You will learn to control your magic and your attitude and become a fully trained sorcerer, or you will become nothing at all." After 4 years on the font, I'd rather thought my father had overlooked the possibility that I could become a fully trained sorcerer and still amount to nothing at all. But Graham was right. I could write charms at least. I reached into my pocket and retrieved paper and quill. The words of the Lightfoot charm Grim mentioned were lost to me. I was shit at memorization, but it was the work of momentum. But it was the work of a moment to come up with my own version of the spell, combining what words in the old language I remembered with a few more I found fitting. When passing, he said. There was plenty of light from the street from him to read by, so I thought the show he made of squinting and frowning down the paper was a bit much. This is incorrect. It's not, I said. I, I, I just couldn't remember the words to the lifeless spell, so I wrote my own. It should work the same, mostly. Grim stared at me. Surely you've memorized something as basic as that by now. I shrugged. It didn't stick. Grim looked horrified by the admission. He took ages reading over the spell again, probably searching it for traps. This was insulting, and perhaps not entirely unwarranted. Grim and I had been collecting grievances against each other since first year, like honey catches flies. I'd once tricked him into casting a charm that turned his pale hair a delightful shade of pink. I thought it was rather fetching, but he vehemently disagreed. That incident had been the launching point for the enmity that had struck like a thorn between us ever since. Once he assured himself the spell was, as I said, yes. Once he assured himself the spell was as I said, Grim motioned me closer and gingerly grabbed my left arm with his hand. With the other, he held the spell paper between thumb and forefinger and began to cast. His brow furrowed in concentration. Smoke gathered in his hand and rose up in the air as magic ate the words I'd written, burning away the paper as it went. He didn't even have to speak the words of the spell aloud. I would passionately deny admitting this fast, but Grim is a brilliant caster. Most sorcerers can cast silently, but he did it as a matter of course. If he hadn't been even a little bit bitter-natured, this kind of careless display of power might have been attractive. As it was, I found Grim about as appealing as the austere marble statues that graced the font hallways. Just as haughty and twice as cold. Most of our dear mates disagreed with me on the front. Grim had plenty of admirers who are willing to overlook his personality in favor of his talent. Little good it did them. Grim had just given more attention to studying my spell than I'd seen him devote to any of his followers over the years. The paper wasn't even completely finished burning when Grim tugged me forward out. Feet like, wait a minute. The paper wasn't even completely finished burning when Grim tugged me forward and our feet left the ground. The spell was undoubtedly more exciting than the light-foot charm, which floated you upward with all the urgency of dandelion fluff drifting on a light breeze. My version hit with the same adrenaline as a cutlass drop, only in reverse, a sort of falling upward if you like. We had nearly cleared the wall when Grim's free hand shot out and grabbed the nearest tree limb, halting our progress before we could descend on the other side. lips anymore, but our landing was awkward enough that only Grimm's unsteady grip on my arm kept me from tumbling down. I wobbled on top of the wall like a toddler, laughing and giddy, buzzing from the rush. That was brilliant. Why did you stop us? We were going too fast, Grim said, scowling. Your spell likely would have catapulted us at first into the ground had I let it continue. A little of my rush faded, replaced by annoyance. It was one thing to have everyone turn their noses up at me for something that I was admittedly bad at, but my charms worked just fine. I wouldn't have dared to let anyone use them otherwise. Climb down on your own then, if you don't trust my scribing. I pulled my arm away in a quick tug immediately to move towards the nearest tree and away from Grim. But hardly tipsy is not quite the same thing as absolutely sober, especially when one is standing on a narrow bit of stone 10 feet above the ground. I leaned, first one way, then another. My balance was further thrown off by my violin case, heavier than usual thanks to the winnings I'd stashed there. My free arm flailed for something, anything to hold on to, and the only thing within reach was Grim. My fingers caught onto the sash at his waist, causing Grim to cling even tighter to the branch he held, rather than offering any assistance. Let go, he snarled, but I clutched that sash like a lifeline, silk twisting in my grasp. Briefly, I thought it would fold. The fabric was too delicate, though. It gave way under my finger with a hushed rip, and I tumbled over the wall. It was fortunate that there was grass beneath me, rather than stone, but the impact still rattled my bones and sent the case in my grasp bouncing forward to connect with my face, hard enough to leave me seeing stars. I lay there, dazed as something went trickling down my nose, and a metallic tang of blood bloomed at the back of my throat. By the time I managed to sit up, Grim was just finishing making his way down one of the trees, landing with an elegant hop. He slowly leaned over to pick up the pieces of his sash. It had been torn neatly in two. Sorcerers decorate their sashes, you know, or at least most of us do. I never bothered, but Grim's sash was covered in careful stitches that depicted droplets of water and waves. Now the threads trailed through the air, rippled down the middle of the design. Grim folded the pieces carefully and put them in his pocket. Then he looked down at me, coldly furious, and said, I don't know how to manage to keep your place here, you useless lovage. There were many things I had argued with Grim about over the years, but this was not one of them. I didn't say anything now, either, as he walked away. My own uselessness was something I'd spent years perfecting. Not all sorcerers could be like Grim. Some of us